Keisalo. I am from the Department of Social and Cultural Anthropology at the University of Helsinki, and my talk is titled Playful Pets and Funny People on Human, Animal, Play, Humor, and Ritual. And in this presentation I will explore play, humor, and ritual, as it says, and I intend to ask, how do these concepts relate to each other on the one hand, and how do they relate to boundaries between humans and animals on the other hand? Many animals play, but is humor as a form of play the quintessential human trait that requires a very sophisticated sense of symbols? What are some of the ways humor and play figure in social relations among humans and animals and between humans and animals? These are the questions I want to explore. And I will also give some examples of humor in ritual and ritual in humor. And I start from one assumption and from one question. The assumption is that play and humor are closely related, and many, some even say all animals, play. The question is, if we can locate the difference between play and humor, is that also the difference between humans and animals? I am not an ethologist, I don't study animals, I'm an anthropologist, I study people, so I am looking at this very much from the human and anthropological point of view. And I will admit from the start that I am not sure that drawing any hard, fast boundaries is possible or even desirable, for that matter. So rather, what I want to do is to open up some questions, explore the connections and distinctions that can be made. And my own research has focused on comedic performance of ritual clowns of the Yaquis, an indigenous group in Sonora, Mexico. And I am now starting another project looking at stand-up comedians. For the purposes of this paper, I will draw some examples from my research to discuss humor in ritual and ritual in humor, but I will also offer some examples from my own experiences with humans and animals, as I want to address humor and play in close personal relationships as well. And I will start with a short exploration of the concepts, and let me see how this. So these are some of the things I will be talking about, but right. And the humor comes in without me even intending. But anyway, the next slide has the same thing in Finnish, so I'm going to go to the next slide and leave that up for now, just to have some of the points up there in Finnish. And here we go. Alright, so play and humor. What do these concepts have in common? Both involve a sort of true, not true double frame. The make-believe framing of play means that the playful nip of a dog in a mock fight denotes both a bite and not a bite at once. The playful bite may resemble a real bite, but the metacommunicative message marks it as play, as Gregory Bateson had it. Following Richard Schechner, the performance scholar, we could also say that play and humor are not true. Humor is a form of play in the sense that it takes elements of meaning, ideas, objects, points of reference, and mixes them up, relates them in new, surprising, contradictory ways. Verbal joking can be playing with elements of language or social play, for example in the form of trading mock insults. Like the playful bite of the dogs, in the right social situation, the insult is not to be taken as real. I do not want to posit any simple idea of an unproblematic real reality. I rather want to point out that play and humor have complex and often ambiguous relations to other forms of interaction. Often when talking about humor and play, scholars address the question on importance or seriousness. But instead of showing how these things might be important within a framework that presumes them not to be, or insisting they are and leaving it at that, I want to address the framework itself a little bit. Why does a discussion of humor so often begin with a justification for the choice of the topic? In a recent article in The Battler, anthropologist David Graeber, better known for his work on value and debt, discussed play as something that all living beings do, and the reasons that this thought is problematic within a very rationalist scientific worldview. And I have a quote from his article starting, "An analysis of animal behavior is not considered scientific unless the animal is assumed, at least tacitly, to be operating according to the same means/end calculations that one would apply to economic transactions. Under this assumption, an expenditure of energy must be directed towards some goal, unless one can absolutely prove that it isn't." And Graeber goes on to say that in this view, nature is seen, quote, as the theater for a brutal struggle of existence in this, quote, capitalist version of evolution. Yet, he also says in his article that long-term observation of animals seems to show that they do appear to expend energy for no apparent reason other than fun. Graeber cites Peter Kropotkin on how animals cooperate as a form of pleasure. For example, ants arrange what seem to be muck wars. And Graeber finds this to be a sign of beings taking joy in their existence. He suggests the principle of ludic freedom, the exercise of an entity's most complex powers or capacities becoming an end in itself. And for me, in my human experience, this certainly sounds very familiar and plausible. Activities like dance or playing ping pong are examples that come to my mind. But there is still more to play than pleasure and joy. The real/not real, double framing, and ambiguous relation to truth, whatever truth mean that play opens up a world of choices. Graeber refers here to Friedrich Schiller, finding in play the seed of self-consciousness, which leads to freedom, and in the case of humans, morality. Of course, not all play is lofty or positive for all involved. What may be fun for the cat is not necessarily fun for the mouse. The ambiguity of play and humor means that these activities may be indeterminate in meaning and effect. This, what I call their reversibility, means that play and humor do indeed have a useless, throwaway aspect, throwaway component that makes either the activity itself or the attempt to analyze it baffling from a rationalist point of view. But it is our ideas of what is important and useful that make this baffling. So, I will next focus on play that involves social relations and the ways cooperation, rules, boundaries, and meaning come into the question. I argue that both play and humor can be characterized as relatively complete and completely relative. By this I mean that the switch into the play or humor frame in interaction indicates crossing a boundary. The signs of metacommunication indicate that whatever happens in the play frame is not to be interpreted or reacted to in the same way as in another frame of interaction. Animals play fighting do not intend to harm each other, unless of course something happens and the boundary is crossed again and the frame changes again. In verbal joking, humans are not expected to interpret humor the same way as more sincere or straightforward communication. The actions framed as play or humor are in this sense self-contained, yet they are never wholly insulated from other things. Their meanings and consequences depend on their contextual relations. This frame switching happens within certain existing social relations, and this frame switching may create, sustain, or change these relations. The creativity and agency of play and humor is in its relative freedom from and in its ties to other contexts, other symbolic events and orders. And it is also in these relations that I find the differences between play and humor. Why do I say that humor could be the quintessential human characteristic? One way to look at it is as the semiotic difference between kinds of signs. It seems to me that often animal play is mostly about icons, signs that are related to what they refer to through resemblance. And in addition to icons, animal play makes use of indexes, signs that point to something through a part-whole relationship or a cause and effect relationship in the way that smoke indicates fire. A playful nip in a mock fight is iconic of a serious attempt to bite in that it looks or is very much the same in terms of pure resemblance, and a playful nip is indexical in terms of the messages that point to or indicate the non-seriousness of the play fight. But human humor also uses symbols, and these then are signs that have an arbitrary, socially transmitted meaning that is subject to variation, reflection, and interpretation. If all or most or even many living beings play, and social playing at least involves a mutually recognized shift into a play frame, humor involves this in symbolically more complex ways, in the sense of symbolic meaning becoming abstracted from the immediate surroundings. The framing itself may be accomplished in many different ways. Some of the participants may be aware of it, while others are not. The relations of the humorous content are linked to other contexts in symbolic rather than or in addition to iconic or indexical ways. And this means that if in conversation involving several people, if I use a phrase that refers to a memory I share with one friend in the group, this will be an inside joke that is evident to me and my friend, but maybe not to the others in the conversation. The phrase that recalls the memory is an index of the remembered moment, but the moment's meanings to us are symbolical. Beyond requiring extensive linguistic knowledge, humor requires cultural and contextual knowledge. It is partly created through objective forms and partly through subjective perspectives. Of course, linguistic humor provides the clearest example of the possible complexity. Humor can be the most difficult thing to learn in a new language, and certainly very difficult in translation, especially when the humor is on several levels of the language, such as playing on both semantic meaning and phonetic form. On the other hand, humor is possible even with no shared language. It can be an immediate connection too. Humans are quite good at creating moments of understanding through humor. So, do animals have humor? I do not have any definitive answer to this. The differences between the far ends of the humor play continuum are quite clear, I think, but I am not sure where the exact boundary between humor and play would be. But I will go on to talk a little bit about play, humor, and social relations. I will leave the definite boundary question open. Since all I know about play and humor in the social relations of animals is that it seems to be very important, I will make some remarks rather on humor and play in the relations between humans and between humans and animals. First, humans and humans. Humor and social play are very much about boundaries. Don Handelman, in his discussion of clowns, notes that boundaries are ambiguous concepts that can be seen as an amalgam of the very things that they separate. Boundaries both separate and relate things, bring them together in that sense. To Handelman, clown figures carry a boundary within themselves, and to him this is why many ritual clowns appear at moments of transition and transformation. They enable the crossing of boundaries. This idea of containing a boundary can be extended to jokes and their ambiguous, doubled structure. Like clown figures in a ritual, a joke, as a momentary shift into humor, is a way to both keep and cross a boundary. Let's take romance and flirting as an example. This of course can be deadly serious, but humor may be a useful tool in navigating the creation and keeping of this sort of social relation. In terms of boundaries, romance may perhaps be said to aim at erasing or fully crossing a boundary, at least for a moment. Again, an inside joke may be a way to build closeness or index existing closeness. A look at humor and flirting also hints at the gendered aspects of humor, the stereotypical view being that it is a man's job to be funny, and the woman demonstrates her sense of humor by laughing at his jokes. The question, are women funny? Are they even capable of being funny? Comes up periodically. And of course women can be and often are funny, but I suspect that this gendered aspect is related to the efficacy, the power of joking. Humor entails positing a perspective on something. This makes it an act of power. A successful joke makes people laugh. It has an effect on them. This and certain aspects of form are some of the ways humor can be connected to ritual. I will come back to this a little bit later, but I will first say something about play in the relations between humans and animals. And again, I am more an observer than a scholar here, but I will try to apply my anthropological perspective to this as well. In many of the relations I have had with animals, mostly dogs, cats, and horses, playing has been an important part. But what happens when we play? I don't know what it means for the animal, beyond being convinced that the animal enjoys it and even expects it. When I was a child, I often played a chasing game with our dog, a German Shepherd. And this would work so that I would run with his toy, and the dog would chase me, looking ferocious, his teeth bared, barking, running. And then I would suddenly stop, and the dog's entire demeanor would change. He relaxed, he put his ears down and back, he would look down and start licking my hands, all docile and caring. Then I would run again, and the dog would take off in pursuit. And it was these changes that I enjoyed the most. The exciting idea of being chased by this growling monster that I could 100% trust to turn into a sweet doggy. And I also knew that this dog would very seriously defend me, if necessary. And I don't know, of course, what the dog thought of it. All I know is that he was always eager and willing to play with me, following me around, attentive to all I did. And I don't think it could have been just about wanting to please me, as he did not approach just anything humans came up with this sort of enthusiasm. Visits to the vet for shots turned the dog into a quiet, shivering, withdrawn animal. Ambiguity in relations. And I I will come back to the dog a little bit later again too. But humor can help navigate or mediate ambiguity in social relations and situations. In cases where there is certainty beneath the play, the idea of ambiguity is safe and exciting, like a horror movie, or like my games with the dog. In cases where the ambiguity is real, humor or playing can be a way of acknowledging the ambiguity or navigating it. If I joke with my boyfriend, the context is the security or insecurity in the relationship. If I joke with someone I have just met but am flirting with, the joking may be a way to communicate interest, yet give space to back off with our faces intact. So, to talk a little bit about ritual in play, humor in ritual and ritual in humor. If the idea that play and humor are close to each other is likely to be more easy to accept, sometimes play and ritual are seen as opposites. And I'm sort of thinking if I could move so that we could see, so shall we switch places? Great. So sometimes play and ritual are seen as opposite concepts. European Christians often tend to think of ritual as solemn and serious. And since I'm on this side, I will this way. For example, in an introductory anthropology book, anthropologists Emily Schultz and Robert Lavenda oppose the play frame, as in let's make believe, to the ritual frame, as in let's believe. And while this is one possible starting point, it's no universal truth. There are many rituals where play and humor are integral, and this is where I'll talk a little bit about my own work on ritual clowns in the Easter ritual of the Yakis. And ritual clowns are common among many other indigenous groups in the Americas as well, and clowning occurs in rituals in many other parts of the world. Finding ritual in humor, on the other hand, requires a bit more consideration of the concept of ritual. And I don't really use or even advocate any fixed or clear definition, but for the purposes of this discussion, I will focus on certain aspects of form, meaning, and efficacy to look for ritual in my example of stand-up comedy. And of course the games my dog and I played could be looked at as something ritualized. It was a form well known to both me and the dog. It was repeated periodically within our relationship, our social relation, and as a performance of that social relation. But I'll now offer two examples from these very different scenes of comedic performance. I describe a bit of clowning by two Chapayeka clowns from the Yaqui Easter ritual that I saw during my field work in Sonora, Mexico in 2007. And I will describe a bit from Louis C.K.'s stand-up comedy show Word, live at Carnegie Hall from 2010. And my theoretical starting point here is Roy Wagner's model of culture as a dynamic combination of convention, and that is the established known cultural elements, and invention, different, innovative, possibly unique extensions of these known elements into new forms. And I will demonstrate how these two comedic performances I describe put the two semiotic modes of convention and invention, and these are frames of both expression and frames of interpretation for the audiences, and how these convention and invention are put into a dialectic relation with each other. And this way, certain contextually relevant conventions and inventions are mutually defined and mediated, and this allows the clowns and the comedians to engage with contradictions and ambiguities of life and still allow these contradictory objects to keep their defining characteristics. Put differently, comedic performers can create, call attention to, and cross various boundaries while still keeping those boundaries intact. And the analysis also draws from anthropologist Rupert Stash's idea of ritual or performances, in this case maybe, as poetically dense figurations of macrocosmic orders in microcosmic action here and now. And both of these examples of ritual humor or ritualized humor play with cultural elements and relations by putting something in the wrong place. What are the specific boundaries being drawn and crossed, mediated in these instances, and what effects can this have? And what can an analysis of the respective patterns of convention and invention in these performances reveal about the comedic power that they may have in their respective contexts? So first, the Chapayecas. The Yaquis are an indigenous group in northern Mexico. Their Easter ritual is a depiction of the way of the cross, the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus. Different cosmological powers and principles are represented by various ceremonial groups. The Chapayecas are masked clown figures that represent Judas and the Roman soldiers as part of the Fariseo group, the Pharisees, whose aim is to capture and kill Jesus. The Chapayeca masks depict various powerful and other beings, such as non-Yaqui humans, animals, circus clowns, even figures from TV and films. The Chapayecas combine two forms or modes of performance in that they perform set conventional actions that are repeated year to year. And they also improvise and invent new actions that may only be performed once. This is what sets the Chapayecas apart from the other performers of the ritual. The others are expected to only perform conventional actions. Anything beyond that would be ignored or considered a mistake. On the Wednesday of Holy Week, in an event called Miércoles de Tinieblas, Twilight Wednesday, the church gradually becomes dark as the candles are put out one by one. The members of the ceremonial group representing the church and the Christian figures sing and pray, while the Fariseos stand in lines reaching from the door of the church into the plaza out front. The Chapayecas come up to the altar in pairs, get down on the ground, and crawl around the altar, stopping 2 times to knock together the wooden knife and sword they carry as a way to signal to each other. After the circle is complete, they rise, shake their hip rattles, and return to the line, scraping off their swords as they do after any contact with sacred objects. When the Chapayecas inside the church knock their weapons together, the others standing outside in lines shake their hips, answering with their rattles. I observed this event in the town called Cocorit in 2004, 2006, and in 2007. But there was one scene I saw only in 2007. The following sequence took place when 2 Chapayecas with circus clown masks took their turn. The first clown stopped halfway to the altar, took out a red yo-yo, and started playing with it. The other clown gestured, "Come on," with his knife and pointed to the altar. And the Chapayecas cannot speak, they only communicate in gestures. And then the one that wanted to go and get the conventional thing over with. After Jane come on, he pointed his knife to his wrist as if at a watch. When this had no effect, he leaned his elbow on his sword propped up like a cane, drumming his fingers on his temple in despair, so like this. Finally, after taking some time, the first clown stopped playing with the yo-yo, came to the altar, shook his hips, and got down. After the tiniest of pointed pauses, the other one did so as well. After they had completed the circuit, the first clown again stopped to play with the yo-yo. The second one exasperatedly covered his face in his hand and marched off rapidly to join the line. The first clown made his way back more slowly, pausing on his way to tease another fariseo with the yo-yo. And this is an example of how the chapayeka clowning may interrupt the ritual. While these interruptions are expected, when and how they actually happen is unpredictable. While playing with a yo-yo is conventional in certain situations, like children in a schoolyard, it is in stark contrast to the conventions of the Yaki Easter ritual. Bringing it there is an act of invention. The other chapayeka's reaction was an improvisation within the here and now frame that included both the ritual and the playing with the yo-yo. He, too, reverted into the mode of invention to try to convince the other chapayeka to return to convention, as they both eventually did when they joined the line. Bringing in a yo-yo potentially undermines the ritual's conventional context, even as its meaning as invention is dependent on this ritual context. The yo-yo does not belong in the ritual, but it is part of the same world or macrocosmic order as the ritual. The repeated, established, sacred, conventional ritual actions enact the Yaki Easter ritual as a meaningful symbolic event that has a form, as a bound and separate form, separated from other events or situations. In that the chapayeka shifts between invention and convention allow them to cross this boundary drawn around the ritual, they mediate the relations between the here and now of the ritual and other contexts, scenes, or spatio-temporal orders, as Stash says. And I will come back to the implications this has after describing my second example of comedic performance. And this comes from Louis C.K.'s bit. And the bit is called Schindler's List, and it is from the encore of stand-up comedian Louis C.K.'s album called Word, live at Carnegie Hall, recorded in 2010. And in this bit, Louis tells the story of how, when rewatching the 1993 film Schindler's List about the Holocaust, he notices a moment in a scene where the Jews are being forced out of Warsaw. A little girl in a pretty dress is standing on a mailbox, screaming, "Goodbye, Jews!" at them. Louis then starts talking about how the auditions might have gone for this part. And the bit plays with themes of what is artificial and real, as well as moralities. While making a film of terrible historical events might be a moral act, there is an irony in the ways it entails the deliberate recreation of awful moments. By imagining and enacting various possible scenarios, Louis engages with a multitude of things that may be seen as contradictory, such as terrible historical events, cute children, and the film industry. Like the clowning of the chapayekas, Louis' stand-up comedy is grounded in conventions, the conventions of performance that make it a recognizable genre, the sociable and professional way Louis relates to his audience most of the time, and the existing things referred to in the stories. From this starting point, Louis shifts into invention, performing his individual perspective, imagining and acting out events, sometimes making up words and phrases, or exploring and extending their meanings and reacting to the audience. Also, like in the case of the Chapayekas, the invention threatens the convention even as it relies on this convention for its meaning. In Louis' case, this usually happens through the display of potentially antisocial or inappropriate aspects of individual thought and action. One form of shifting between invention and convention is the use of different voices or perspectives. There is Louis the performer narrating, recording, and commenting on the events, and Louis the individual imagining or reenacting, reacting within, and living the events. For example, when Louis describes watching the particular scene in Schindler's List, he says, "And this really struck me, and probably the Jews too, that it happened to," and he starts to laugh in a sort of horrified way towards the end of this line. And this could be interpreted as Louis acknowledging both the possible similarity and the huge gap between his own reaction and the reaction of the people actually experiencing the events. Paradoxically, experiencing and calling attention to the similarity may be seen as inappropriate due to the dissimilarity of the actual experiences. Yet, experiencing the similarity is necessary for empathy. Paradoxical combination of convention, recognition of the moral implications, and invention, Louis' individual immediate reaction, provides a way to engage with the contradictions of the world and oneself in it. Another bit of invention is the way Louis bids the audience adieu with a friendly "Goodbye, Jews," when Louis is actually saying goodbye to the audience in the outro. First, Louis set up the ground by referring to the scene in the existing film. Then he shifted into invention by imitating little girl actresses giving the line in an audition. Both of these are the ground for this final invention and extension, as Louis says the line as himself, addressing the audience in the here and now of the performance. This element in the wrong place does several things. It highlights the differences between the spatio-temporal orders it has occurred in. As a representation, it is a reversal of reality in that Louis is not an anti-Semitic and angry little girl, and the audience is not facing concentration camps. It is also a shift in the relation between Louis and the audience. When Louis addresses the audience in the inventive mode, the microcosm of performance in relation to the macrocosmic order is defined differently. It is no longer Louis plus audience, separated from the world outside the performer by a boundary mediated by Louis. The boundary that Louis is mediating now is drawn between himself and the audience. As Louis ends his show and sends off his audience, they are, again, part of the world where oppression, wars, and genocide exist, implicated in its moral conundrums and challenges. While Goodbye Jews brings out the differences between the situations, it also opens up the question of possible similarities. If the Chapayekas mediate the relations between the ritual and other, including many non-ritual orders, as well as potentially other ritual orders, in Louis' stand-up the relations between the individual self and other persons and the world are mediated. When Louis says "Goodbye, Jews" to the audience, this is similar to bringing a yo-yo into the ritual. Both acts threaten conventional ritual figures that stop their search for Jesus to play with yo-yos are more of a threat than ritual figures that would go through with their mission to kill Jesus, staying within the ritual's conventional frame. If the mediation of boundaries is not done skillfully, it could collapse the entire situation. Both the Chapayekas and Louis have freedom and autonomy in and of their context of performance in certain ways. But the meaningfulness or efficaciousness of their actions are relative to the conventional context, which they also take part in creating and sustaining. In the beginning of Louis' show, there is a bit called I Could Ruin Your Night, where Louis discusses how he could give a bad performance, the repercussions this could have, and his reasons and motivations for wanting to give a good performance. In a way, giving a bad show would be a comedian's most real and immediate threat to convention, but this would also, of course, jeopardize his or her chances to continue invention. The relations of convention and invention also highlight the key differences between these performances. Ultimately, the existence of the Chapayekas as yaki ritual figures is dependent on their conventional context. Their inventions, including the otherness of the figures portrayed in the masks, bring something powerful in to a specific convention. The yaki is the ritual. When this power is set against other cosmological powers and principles active in the ritual, the conventions are revitalized. Louis, of course, would continue to exist as an actual individual person without stand-up. His performance is about bringing something out, an individual perspective brought into relation with a conventional worldview, which Louis participates in as a person and sets up for his audience as a performer. So perhaps in this sense, an analysis of comedic performance as a dialectic of invention and convention also provides a perspective on how they can change things, what Stash calls the world-making consequentiality or the world-making possibilities of rituals and performances, and some of the ways that microcosmic and macrocosmic orders are co-constitutive. They create each other out of each other. The conventional actions set up the ground for performance, and a little skillful invention is enough to highlight aspects of this ground, make visible and create relations, to question, strengthen, or weaken existing conventions, to establish new ones as grounds for further inventions. The potential to shift into the semitic mode of invention makes comedic performers unpredictable, potentially efficacious, even dangerous. Their power lies in how skillfully they relate these inventions to conventions. So, coming up on very short conclusion, in this presentation, I have tried to weave together play, humor, and ritual, and show how certain connections, distinctions, are ways of drawing and crossing different kinds of boundaries, and sometimes both drawing and crossing the boundary at the same time. And this has many different possibilities for social relations, for creating worlds, for imagining and bringing things into existence even. Immensely complex, yet capable of creating moments of immediate connection, cooperation, and understanding, play, humor, and ritual are very powerful as elements, symbols, and forms of action. So, thank you.